In June 2025, the gavel of justice will fall hard across 6 states as 6 death row inmates are scheduled to be executed in a single month. 2 in Florida and 1 each in Alabama, South Carolina, Oklahoma, and Mississippi. These aren't just names on a list. They're the dark echoes of crimes that shocked communities, shattered families, and gripped the nation. Each case carries a grim story of violence, loss, and years of courtroom battles that led to the final decision. In this video, we unravel the haunting pasts of these individuals, uncover the paths that brought them to death row, and examine the final steps the justice system will take as their execution dates draw near. First on the list, Anthony Floyd Waywright, scheduled for execution on June 10th, 2025, at exactly 6 p.m. inside the solemn walls of Florida State Prison in Rayford. Waywright, now 54, is scheduled to die by lethal injection. Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant on May 9th, marking the end of a legal saga that began over 30 years ago. But to truly understand the weight of this sentence, we must return to a chilling April evening in 1994, when a routine grocery trip turned into a nightmare. That night, 23-year-old Carmen Gayart was loading bags into her car at a Winn-Dixie supermarket in Florida. She had no idea she was being watched by 2 dangerous escapees, Anthony Wainwright and Richard Eugene Hamilton. Recently broken out of prison, the duo was desperate and armed. They forced Carmen into their vehicle and drove her to a remote patch of wilderness in Hamilton County. There, in complete isolation, she suffered an unthinkable fate. After sexually assaulting her, they ended her life and left her body to the elements.
But their flight from justice didn't last long. Just a day later, on April 28th, the pair was captured in Mississippi after exchanging gunfire with local police. Under intense interrogation, they confessed and revealed the location of their victim. On the morning of May 2nd, Carmen's decomposed remains were discovered. Bringing a heartbreaking end to the search and delivering the cruel truth to her grieving family, the trial was swift and conclusive. In June 1995, both Waywright and Hamilton were convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and robbery. The court handed down the ultimate punishment, death. For nearly 30 years, Waywright clung to every legal avenue available, filing appeal after appeal, each one denied. His time is nearly up. On July 12, 1995, justice was rendered as both Anthony Wainwright and Richard Eugene Hamilton were sentenced to death for the brutal murder of 23-year-old Carmen Gayart. Decades passed, and while Hamilton died of natural causes on death row in January 2023, the clock continues to tick for Waywright. Now, after exhausting every legal appeal, Anthony Wainwright is set to face his fate. On June 10, 2025, at exactly 6 p.m., he is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford, closing the final chapter on a case that has haunted Florida for over 30 years. But Waywright isn't the only one on death row counting down the days this June. Just 2 weeks later, Florida will carry out another execution, that of 51-year-old Thomas Gudinas. Scheduled for June 24, 2025, his name is tied to one of Orlando's most harrowing cases, the 1994 rape and murder of 22-year-old Michelle McGrath. That night, May 23rd, Gudinas and his roommates had been drinking and smoking marijuana before heading to Barbarella's nightclub. When the club closed around 3 a.m., Michelle was seen leaving alone at approximately 2:45 a.m., and she was never seen alive again. By 7:30 a.m., her lifeless body was discovered near Pace School. The evidence painted a grim picture: blunt force trauma, signs of sexual assault, and a timeline of death between 3 and 5 a.m. What followed was a swift unraveling of the truth. Multiple witnesses came forward. Michelle Smith testified that Gudinas had tried to force his way into her car that same night. Colbert Presley, another key witness, admitted to finding Michelle's keys and clothing and handing them over to Gudinas, who bizarrely claimed ownership. A school employee, Jane Brand, saw Gudinas near the crime scene shortly before the body was found. His roommates later revealed that he hadn't returned home after the club closed. When he finally did, he had blood on his underwear and visible injuries. Two of them claimed he confessed to the crime. Gudinas was arrested in May 1994, just days after Michelle's murder. Investigations revealed a troubling history: prior felony convictions in Massachusetts during his youth. Despite filing multiple appeals over the years, all were ultimately denied.
On May 23rd, 2025, exactly 31 years after the crime, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant. Now Gudinas awaits his final hour, set to be carried out by lethal injection. As we continue this countdown to justice, we turn next to Mississippi, where one of America's longest-serving death row inmates, Richard Gerald Jordan, awaits execution. Richard Gerald Jordan is the oldest person on death row in the state. At 78 years old, he has been behind bars for almost 50 years. But his story didn't start in prison. It began in 1976, when Jordan, once a Vietnam War veteran and father of 3, found himself drowning in financial trouble. That's when he made a terrible decision. He planned to kidnap someone for ransom money. On January 12, 1976, pretending to be a worker from the electric company, Jordan went to the home of bank officer Charles Martyr. But Charles wasn't home. Instead, Jordan found Charles's wife, Edwina, and their 3-year-old son. He left the child behind and took Edwina with him. He forced her to drive deep into the DeSoto National Forest. In that quiet, remote place, Jordan ended her life with a single gunshot. Afterward, he called Charles and lied, saying Edwina was alive and demanding $25,000 for her return. But Jordan never got the money. He was caught the very next day and admitted to everything. In July 1976, he was sentenced to death, but his case didn't end there. Jordan's original sentence was overturned because of legal issues with the trial. Still, the state kept fighting for justice. Jordan was sentenced to death 4 different times over the years, each followed by appeals and court battles. Finally, after decades of delays, Mississippi has scheduled his execution for June 25, 2025. Nearly 50 years after the crime, the clock is running out. Another case filled with betrayal and violence is that of Steven Stano, who is scheduled to be executed in South Carolina on June 13, 2025. Born on a U.S. naval base in Cuba, Stano spent time in prison in the 1990s for assault and kidnapping. During his sentence, he even co-wrote a book about life behind bars. After his release in 2004, he moved to Myrtle Beach, tried to rebuild his life, and lived with his girlfriend, Laura Ling. But behind the scenes, something dark was building. On April 7, 2005, Stano strangled Laura in their home and brutally attacked her teenage daughter, cutting her throat. The daughter, barely clinging to life, managed to call for help and survived. The very next day, Stano visited a 74-year-old friend named Henry Turner. During what seemed like a normal visit, he shot and killed Turner, then stole his car and money. Stano was arrested a few days later in Georgia. In 2006, he was sentenced to death for Laura's murder and the attack on her daughter. In 2009, he received a second death sentence for killing Turner. His lawyers claimed he had brain issues, but the courts found his actions to be cold and calculated. In May 2025, his final appeal was denied. Then we turn to Oklahoma, where another execution is set for June 12, 2025. John Fitzgerald Hansen was found guilty of a crime that still sends chills through Tulsa. On August 31, 1999, Hansen and his accomplice, Victor Miller, had just robbed a liquor store, but they wanted more. They spotted 77-year-old Mary Agnes Bees, a retired banker, in a mall parking lot. Their plan: steal her car and any valuables she had. They forced her into her own vehicle and drove her to a quiet, isolated gravel pit. The stories don't end here. Let's now turn to Oklahoma, where a horrifying crime from 1999 still haunts the city of Tulsa. On August 31st, 77-year-old Mary Agnes Bees, a retired banker, was kidnapped in broad daylight from a shopping mall parking lot. Her attackers, John Fitzgerald Hansen and Victor Miller, had just robbed a liquor store and were desperate to escape. They saw Mary alone and decided to steal her car. What they didn't expect was a witness. At a quiet dirt pit outside the city, 44-year-old Gerald Max Thurman, who happened to own the land, saw the men with Mary. Trying to help, Thurman was shot by Miller. Moments later, Hansen shot Mary multiple times and left her body partially hidden under branches. A week passed before her body was discovered, and by then, the men had already struck again. Just 2 days later, on September 9th, police arrested Hansen and Miller at a local motel after they robbed a federal credit union. In 2001, Hansen was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Miller, though involved, was given life without parole. Hansen's lawyers later claimed he had autism and was influenced by Miller, who they said led the attack, but courts rejected those arguments. After years of appeals, Hansen was moved from a Louisiana prison to Oklahoma in early 2025. His execution is now set for June 12th. Meanwhile, in Alabama, another execution is scheduled just 2 days earlier, on June 10th, 2025. The state plans to use nitrogen gas to carry out the death sentence of Gregory Hunt, a method that has raised ethical questions. Hunt's crime took place in the small town of Cordova back in 1988. Karen Lane, a 26-year-old woman, was found dead in the apartment she shared with her friend. Hunt, who had dated Karen for only a month, broke into the apartment late at night. According to investigators, he attacked and killed her in a violent rage. The autopsy revealed nearly 60 injuries, many to her head. Hunt later admitted the crime to his sister and another inmate. In 1990, he was convicted on 3 counts of capital murder and sentenced to death. Since then, Hunt has remained on death row, with his appeals denied and the original sentence upheld. Both of these cases are painful reminders of how far-reaching the consequences of violence can be. As execution dates near, these stories draw attention not only to the crimes themselves, but also to the long road of justice that follows. Stay with us as we follow the final steps in these haunting cases, each one a powerful reflection of loss, punishment, and time's relentless grip. Subscribe to our channel to get more interesting videos like this.